Okay. So the first question I'm going to address today, which is really the central question, is the question of how best do we include questions of global inequity, which includes global extreme poverty and inequalities within countries, between countries, intra and inter country inequities. So my central thesis is that while inequities are global inequity is important, it becomes extremely harmful. We can only study it or understand it with regards to catastrophic and existential risks at the points where it intersects with such risks. Now, the reason is because global inequity, which includes global poverty and all sorts of global injustice, are the result of social processes. And social processes are man-made, they're based on decisions, they're human-made, forgive me. They're based on decisions, they're based on actions, inactions. Therefore, they're not the same kind of things like other risks. Traditionally, what we study at risk, for instance, they're not incidents, right? It's not about whether or not someone did something with an atomic bomb or a dirty bomb. It's not an incident. A social process is a different kind of phenomenon. So no. So to the question of does it make sense to include global justice considerations as a separate cause of risk, I would answer no, because it is only at the point of intersection that we study that. So the next question I'm going to address is the question of, so how does global inequity and injustice affect the current level of global catastrophic risk and the ability to manage it? Now, I would answer that by first explaining that it exacerbates effect on and response to. It is not, its profile is different. Therefore, it's, of course, the danger is in the intersection. Now we have to separate occurrence and response. So if a catastrophic harm occurs, how do we respond to it? Yes, inequality draws this huge line, as we can see with climate change. There's a big line between how it affects us and how we're able to respond to it. And I will say at this point that is the difference between anthropogenic and non-anthropogenic risks, right? There are certain risks that come and we have absolutely no control about those risks, right? That is one category of the potential of such harms. Anthropogenic harms, we have some measure of control. Now, part of the confusion and the overlap is, let's think about climate change, for instance. Do we have control? We have control over creating it, but we have little control over how it now explodes on us, right? But we have control over how we can respond to it. So it becomes a different kind of thing from a real non-anthropogenic risk, like something from outer space, for instance, harming the planet. So they're different. So if we want to talk about worsening, let's think about occurrence and let's think about response. If we divide it, then we can see that where you are on the socioeconomic ladder has nothing to do with whether or not a non-anthropogenic risk could harm you, but it affects whether or not you can respond to it and how well you can respond to it. And so that's all I'm going to say about that because my time is limited. Then I'm going to go into the question of, which is really related, a related question of, does the distribution of international political and economic power play into the current level of global risks, right? And the way I would respond to that is, I'll rephrase the question. Basically, this question is saying, to what extent does economic, do social processes, global social processes. That's how you can categorize economic and political processes. To what extent do they contribute to risk? So to an extent, I have already discussed that. It doesn't affect how certain things affect you, but it affects how your ability to respond to it. Then, now, to the extent, so the third question I'm going to address is the question of to what extent do current notions of global catastrophic risk reflect the particular views and concerns of global elites? And does this mean they need to change? I don't think that is fair to global elites. I don't think that question is fair. That's a very loaded question. Yes, of course, they do have access, they have leisure, they have more resources, they are able to address this question. But the question now is, a global catastrophic risk is a risk precisely because it is global, right? It affects everybody else. Now, the global division of labor, it makes sense for people who are able to address such issues. Now with regards to this word, this phrase that is bandied around now, implicit bias, issues like implicit bias, of course they show up, but think about it. Academic research is elitist, right? And it affects everybody. Am I a typical African Nigerian woman? No. And my location is the reason why I can even have this conversation. So I don't think it's fair to say, oh, only the elites. Yes, only the elites are discussing it. They should discuss such issues with some awareness of where they're located. But I don't think that the questions should change because the questions are indeed global questions. So there should be a multiplicity of perspectives. We should try and diversify, but I don't think the questions are questions that pertain to any particular group. Now, the next question I'm going to address is the question of Lord Martin Rees's book, the 20-year-old book, right? That is the frame of this conference. So one particular issue that I'm going to, very rich book, totally relevant 20 years later, but I'm going to focus on the question of error versus terror. And you have to remember that research has changed, both in existential risk research and global justice research, particularly global justice research and its intersection with philosophy, right? And 20 years later, we have deeper understandings, better understandings. Error versus terror remains relevant, right? So this is human agency. It is either you're being deliberately malevolent or you made a mistake, like, oops, I blew up a continent, right? So those distinctions are valid. However, how do we now apply this to global social processes, right? And their potential to harm. One of the things I'd like to add is, let us look at global harms that derive from global processes from a particular perspective. Why don't we look at it as processes that harm the environment? However, they harm both the physical environment and the human environment. It is not politically correct to question the global economic, financial, political, and economic order. But it's important to note that global justice research has shown that at the level of large collectives, lack is no longer an economic issue. Lack becomes a political issue. It is a power issue, right? So error versus terror makes sense, but to what extent can we categorize social, political, and economic systems under error versus terror? My position is that we are where we are globally because of action and inaction. It doesn't matter how complex it is. The important thing is that whatever a person does is an expression of agency. There could be a long distance between action and eventual reaction or eventual effect. that leads to a particular reaction. But the important thing is that expression of agency creates responsibility. So I will not say that error versus terror is wrong, or we can't use it anymore. But I think it could be problematized. It could be made more complex to accommodate what research has shown in the last 20 years. Now, the next question I'm going to address is the question of, I've already gone into it, the question of responsibility. If we're going to address economic systems, political systems that are producing detrimental results, we need to rephrase those systems as the violation of the negative duty not to harm. It becomes very problematic when it is complex. The more complex it is, the more problematic it is, the more people can shirk responsibility. But this is an important thought. Holding that thought on one side, on the other hand, is the question of how inequity and poverty and inequality intersects with catastrophic or existential harms. Last note about inequity and inequality. Sometimes we think because a society is poor, therefore there's a limit to what people have access to. I'd like to point out that the Gini coefficient is the poorer a community is, let me put it in simple terms, not in economic terms. The poorer a society is, the higher the inequities and inequalities within the society. Now, this is received wisdom, we all know this. Now, I'd like to point out the meaning of inequality within a poor society. What that means is that you have a small fraction of people with a lot of money, a lot of access to resources, access to huge quantities of resources. That is the definition of inequality, economic inequality. It means that the money is amassed somewhere. Now, this is related to existential and catastrophic risks, particularly anthropocentric risks, particularly risks that are related to technology and misuse of technology. Do not presume that because a society is poor, therefore that society does not have access to that which can harm the whole world. The society does have access to that which can harm the whole world. However, that access is concentrated to within a very, very small group of people. Now, how such social processes intersect with existential and catastrophic risks is subject for needed additional research, but it's important to know that it is at these intersections that we should be concerned, particularly if we're global justice researchers. And at that point, I'm going to end. Thank you very much for listening. Look forward to meeting you. Bye.